exciting. It was exciting, but then all of a sudden, it just turned to rubble. It was almost apocalyptic. And then that felt sad. That felt sad because it was a part of our past that would no longer be there.
I think Las Vegas has a reputation for destroying its history, for imploding the famous hotels up and down the Las Vegas Strip, the videos on network television, people cheering as these buildings come tumbling down. That's the reputation of the city, that we don't preserve our history. But there are many great exceptions to that rule. Places like the Federal Building in downtown Las Vegas, where one of the most iconic buildings in the city's history remains standing today.
Once the home of a busy post office and courthouse, the Federal Building has a long and storied history in the city. At first, it represents what Las Vegas wants to become. And now, the building represents what Las Vegas wants to remember. At the turn of the 20th century, Las Vegas consists of a few isolated ranches. That starts to change in the fall of 1904.
At that moment, the construction of the railroad was just moving into Las Vegas, or the Las Vegas Valley.
Located between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City, and rich in artesian wells, Las Vegas becomes an important railroad depot. In 1910, fewer than 1,000 people live in Las Vegas, and the federal government has a low profile in this small desert town.
If you wanted protection of the federal government or you were charged with a federal crime, you had to take a 2-day trip from Las Vegas, 2 days if you were lucky and the trains were running on time, to Carson City, Nevada, where the federal courthouse was located.
Early in the 20th century, the post office was on the old Stewart Ranch.
And then it was moved into what is now the city of Las Vegas in February of 1905. It was a tent. And then it moved further down and became part of the city's only bank.
The post office serves as a key bridge in America, linking small rural communities like Las Vegas to the rest of the country. Postal service becomes essential, not just for communications, but for shipping goods such as food and building supplies.
As the town grew, the post office also grew. So it moved across the street, basically, to where the Golden Nugget Hotel Casino was located.
In the early 1920s, Las Vegans begin lobbying for a dedicated post office and federal courthouse. It will be a 9-year campaign to secure a federal building. The turning point is the government's decision to build Hoover Dam 35 miles south of Las Vegas.
President Calvin Coolidge signed the bill that the Congress had passed saying, yes, they're going to build the dam. And that was December of 1928. And at that moment, the town changed dramatically. Population nearly doubled within a year. In 1929, the population of Las Vegas went from roughly a little over 2,000 people to close to 5,500 people overnight.
This massive construction project offers thousands of jobs while the country is suffering through one of the worst economic downturns in America's history, the Great Depression.
It drew many people to the city because it was now going to be the place where they might be able to get a job during the Depression, right? The Depression had, 25% unemployment across the country. People were desperate for work.
Las Vegas isn't entirely immune from the Great Depression, but frankly, The construction of Hoover Dam is a pretty good antibiotic.
As the population in Las Vegas explodes, it heightens the need for a federal building and the services it provides. But Las Vegas is not alone.
Las Vegas in the 20s and 30s was a small town. It was competing with other cities like Prescott, Arizona, Tampa, Florida, small cities that had great growth potential.
Congress allocates money for a large-scale construction program with the passage of the Public Buildings Act of 1926.
The decisions on which buildings to build fell to the Treasury Department and the folks in the Office of the Supervising Architect, as they were known. And they built hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buildings using the funding from that act.
Projects developed over the years by the Office of the Supervising Architects span from the Custom House in San Francisco to the Federal Triangle in Washington, D.C. Their work is so influential, they are referred to as the architects to the nation. Nevada's politicians push hard for a federal building in Las Vegas and succeed.
It was agreed that Las Vegas would get one, and in 1929, $200,000 had been allocated for it, then another $20,000 to buy the site.
The building will be built in a grand neoclassical style, which harkens back to the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome.
Federal public buildings were intended to be grand, to represent the government, to represent solidity and modernity, even though they were throwbacks to classical architecture.
Congress allocates the funding, but no site has been chosen.
When it was announced that Las Vegas was going to get a federal building, it was big news. It was exciting news. It was something that would identify Las Vegas as a real community. But in that excitement, hands went up saying, I've got a perfect place for it. I've got land within the city of Las Vegas. It's near the Clark County Courthouse. That's where it should be. Other people said, I've got a great spot for it. And then there was an effort by the city that also said, wait a minute, we've got all this space over here in the fairgrounds that was given to us by the Union Pacific Railroad for a public purpose, and we can let you have it real cheap.
The city offers land on Stewart Avenue and 3rd Street on the fairgrounds site, also known as City Park. But a federal construction engineer, John Lammers, objects. Because, in his words, it's in an undesirable part of the city.
And that's because the proposed site was a half a block away from the red light district, known as Block 16, and was a half a block away from another area called Block 17.
When the railroad company, co-owned by Union Pacific and Senator William Clark, creates the Las Vegas town site in 1905, it's divided into blocks. The company designates 2 blocks, 16 and 17, where alcohol can be sold.
They would be the only 2 places, the only 2 blocks where alcohol would be allowed to be served in the saloon retail outlets. And during the May 15th, 1905 auction, the lots on the Block 16 were some of the highest, if not the highest priced lots, because that's where you could sell alcohol. That's where the saloons would be.
Block 16 becomes the red light district, offering not only alcohol, but gambling and prostitution as well.
The challenge was that the town didn't need 2 blocks, Block 16 and Block 17.
The railroad finally reduced the prices on Block 17 lots after the enactment of Prohibition in Nevada in 1919.
And the entire side of 3rd Street at the east end of Block 17, that entire street sold within a month to 2 different owners. And it became part of what would become the Black community.
Not all Blacks lived right there on that one particular block. It was in and around that area, but that block was dedicated for African Americans.
So there was this push against the black neighborhood on 3rd Street and tied it into Block 16. And the city said, well, tell you what, we're going to take care of those matters. We're going to close Block 16, and we're going to work with the black population.
At a public forum on November 4th, 1929, Mrs. Mary Nettles, one of the founders of the local NAACP, says black residents are, quote, ready and willing to sell their property at a reasonable figure and move elsewhere if that's holding up the federal building. Either that or we'll stay and pay our share of improvements just like anybody else, unquote. An overwhelming majority of citizens ultimately endorsed the site. On December 15th, 1930, Las Vegas transfers the deed for the land to the federal government. Block 16 is shut down for a time after the government commits to the city fairgrounds site, but it reopens after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. The city takes no specific action to move black residents out of Block 17. Once the site is selected, the next battle is over adding a courtroom to the federal building.
Once a decision had made by Congress that a federal building was going to be built in Las Vegas during the dam era, it was quickly misunderstood initially that by the local folks that there was going to be a courthouse, a courtroom built. It was going to be a full-fledged, and it turns out that was not what was initially planned to be built. Literally, the rest of the state, from Tonopah, Nevada, northeast to Elko and to Reno, to Carson City, of course, they opposed it. They opposed it dramatically, including a secret letter that was written by the Nevada's U.S. attorney to the United States Attorney General saying, there's no need for one in Las Vegas. There's no need for a courtroom in Las Vegas. We can handle it here in Carson City. Well, that letter became public, and there was really an outcry in Las Vegas, and there was this battle back and forth between the South and the rest of the state. And the congressional delegation, and finally, after a great deal of work and lobbying by the community of Las Vegas, the city of Las Vegas, the Chamber of Commerce, it was determined in D.C., Washington, D.C., that Las Vegas, in fact, did need a courtroom in its building.
And in 31, they say, yeah, we will put in a courtroom. We need to add 100,000. So now we're talking close to $250,000 the federal government is ready to invest in this and build this building that will provide jobs and a reason to come here and a reason for the citizens of this area to think Las Vegas is not going to disappear in the next big windstorm.
In 1931, the federal government solicits construction bids for the new building. They award the contract to the lowest bidder.
They ended up selecting a company called Plains Construction Company out of Pampa, Texas. And in a matter of weeks, the first sign of problems occurs when local people notice that the building is being built in the wrong place, that the foundation was being located 32 feet off center. The word immediately went back to Washington, we need to fix this right away before it gets worse. But it turned out that Plains Construction had very little money. So eventually, Plains Construction really gave up the job.
Construction grinds to a halt, and the search for a new contractor begins. In June of 1932, a new company is selected, Rosen and Amp Fischel Incorporated of Chicago. By August, construction is again underway. And months later, the building is finally standing in all its glory. The federal building is dedicated on November 11th, 1933, at 300 Stewart Avenue. Las Vegans no longer have to travel 2 days to have their federal cases heard. In the first couple of years, judges from Carson City and California travel to Las Vegas to hold hearings and trials for a week or two in the spring and the fall. While the courtroom on the second floor is often empty in those early years, the federal building quickly becomes a gathering place for the community.
The post office hosts field trips. The kindergartners from the 5th Street School come over, a group of brownies come over, and in fact, the postmaster, Frank Garside, even takes the brownies on a trip to get ice cream after they tour the post office. The Department of Agriculture has tools for people who own farms or gardens. You can even get poisonous gas and strychnine to kill gophers if they're affecting your gardening. The holiday season is especially busy at the post office. The community keeps growing and growing, and that means there's more mail coming and going. And so by 1956, the post office has to borrow trucks from Nellis Air Force Base just to get all of the mail out.
The IRS offices in the federal building are inundated with people lining up to pay their taxes.
So beginning in 1944, the IRS has to start using the federal courtroom as an overflow waiting room for them. And they talk about on the busiest evenings there being 300 people waiting in this area. They're packed in, they're flowing out into the hallways, into the waiting areas, and the IRS is staying open until midnight to accommodate all of these people.
The courtroom is regularly used for naturalization ceremonies. One of Southern Nevada's most revered residents takes the oath to become a U.S. citizen.
In 1957, one particular new citizen is Yonima Bill Tomiyasu, and he's lived in Las Vegas for a long time. He actually moves here in 1914. He's a Japanese American who runs a farm. He actually supplies fruits and vegetables to the Hoover Dam workers and then to the Army airfield. But he's not a citizen until 1957.
The building is also a visual inspiration for the city.
The courthouse was a place of pride, right? This was a place to go look at and admire in a city that did not have these kind of buildings.
And there were some 1,300 federal buildings like this constructed across the United States. This particular building is a rich combination of architectural terracotta, a blended yellow brick. Even though it's only a 3-story building with a basement, it has different material at each level.
The building had quite a grandeur about it. You knew that there was something very special about that. There were brass railings as you walked up the marble stairs.
It was one of the few 3-story buildings in downtown Las Vegas. It was like a sentinel of stability for our community.
By World War II, Las Vegas is booming, bolstered by federal spending, legalized gambling, and liberal divorce laws.
There was so much federal spending for an airfield to train aerial gunners just outside town, and then this massive magnesium plant, which brought in thousands of construction workers and thousands of workers the whole time the plant was in operation. So the boom of the 1930s was extraordinary. The boom of the 40s topped it.
During the war, the federal building is a hive of activity.
This is where the Army and the Navy had their recruiting stations. This is also where the Rationing Board held their offices. So you have people coming in and registering for ration cards. They have to hire new employees to work at the post office. This is really the center of federal activity. That is where the Army airfield first sets up their offices while they're waiting for the airfield and base to be constructed. The post office is seeing a huge influx of new customers as we have people working at Basic Magnesium, these defense workers that are coming in, as well as people from the Army airfield.
The post office extends its hours on Saturdays to accommodate the defense workers.
This is when they're getting their paycheck, they have to go because they're wanting to send money home. And the Western Union office downtown stops offering money orders, and so people are coming to the post office to get that done. And they're seeing a huge flurry of people. On busiest Saturdays, the postmaster, Frank Garside, says that they're seeing up to 3,300 customers every day.
A U.S. Senate committee chaired by Harry Truman, the future president, meets in the federal building. It is investigating alleged war profiteering at the basic magnesium plant in Henderson.
The Truman Committee was formed before the U.S. entered World War II, and this committee was concerned with the U.S. defense industry and what might potentially go wrong. So waste, inefficiency, corruption, the potential for war profiteering, and it becomes known as the Truman Committee because of U.S. Senator Harry Truman, who was on the committee, a senator from Missouri. The Truman Committee visits Las Vegas actually a handful of times, starting in 1942, because they're investigating the construction and then the operations of basic magnesium in Henderson. There is concern that there is a little bit of war profiteering going on.
The government has allocated $133 million to finance construction of the basic magnesium plant for production of the metal used in airplanes, bombs, and ammunition. The Truman Committee cites bungling and incompetence in the plant's construction, while later praising the facility's high level of output. As the war draws to a close, President Franklin Roosevelt nominates Roger T. Foley to serve as the first permanent federal judge in Las Vegas. He's approved by the U.S. Senate and starts hearing cases.
Judge Foley's appointment in 1945 did not immediately result in the courtroom being used on a full-time basis. In fact, Judge Foley did most of his work in the late 1940s. He was in Carson City. Those were the biggest trials tended to be held. He would come down to Las Vegas a few times a year, maybe 2 to 5 times a year, depending on what was happening, to hold hearings and trials in the federal building. With the city's growth, however, Judge Foley found himself in Las Vegas more and more.
My sister Jeannie went with my grandmother when she was about 6 years old to one of Grandpa's trials. And there happened to be a woman that day who had been forging a lot of checks. He was sentencing her to prison. And as he did, there were these 3 little children in the front row, and they all started crying, "Don't take our mommy, don't take our mommy, we need her." Well, Jeannie and Grandma got up and quickly left the courtroom, waited for Grandpa to come for lunch. And my grandma chewed him out and said, "How could you do that to this woman?" And he said, "Oh, don't get too excited. She was here a few months ago and had a whole other set of children that she had paid to do that theatrics."
After the war, the federal building is the setting for several high-profile events. One of the government's major efforts to crack down on organized crime takes place in the federal courtroom.
After World War II, if one picked up a newspaper, it was almost inevitable you would see a story or two about organized crime's impact on virtually every city's government. So the U.S. Senate appointed a special committee and picked an ambitious Tennessee senator named Estes Kefauver to lead the charge.
Climaxing 10 months of nationwide hearings, the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, headed by Senator Kefauver, opens hearings in New York.
This investigation was nationwide. They went to 14 cities. They spent 90 days in hearings. They questioned over 800 witnesses.
I'm not going to answer another question. You just says I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
And the result was the publication of over 11,000 pages of testimony.
They decided to hold a hearing in Las Vegas so that they could learn more about the mob's involvement with the casino industry. They held that hearing in the courtroom on the second floor. This was a big deal in Las Vegas. There was a great deal of concern, on the one hand, of what the Kefauver Committee might discover.
The key person that they interviewed, it was almost 2 hours, was Mo Sedway. And when Sedway took the stand, they asked him, "Do you know any of these fellows?" And they asked him a list of the major organized crime figures in America, like Joe Adonis and Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello and Mo Dalitz. And he said, yeah, I know all those fellows. In fact, 6 weeks ago, I was in New York and I was with Frank Costello in a bar. Well, Mo Sedway is associated with several casinos in Las Vegas, notably the Flamingo.
Evening, Wilbur.
They also interviewed Wilbur Clark, who just opened the Desert Inn, and they knew that he'd been backed by the Cleveland Syndicate, headed by Mo Dalitz.
The Kefauver Committee reserves its hardest line of inquiry for Nevada Lieutenant Governor Cliff Jones, who owns shares in the Thunderbird, Golden Nugget, and Pioneer casinos. The committee also questions Jones about why the Nevada Tax Commission, which oversees gambling licenses, grandfathered in operators with criminal records. Jones defends the policy, saying, quote, "As long as they conduct themselves properly, I think there is probably no harm comes of it," unquote. The Kefauver Committee can do little more than express dismay at Jones's close ties to the gambling industry. But 4 years later, after criminal kingpin Meyer Lansky is linked to the Thunderbird, the Nevada Tax Commission briefly shuts down the casino and suspends Jones's license. The Kefauver Committee is scathing in its assessment of Las Vegas and its connection to organized crime.
Kefauver said, if this is legalized gambling, it's a failure because they have not eliminated people who are linked to organized crime in giving these licenses out. So this becomes a banner story, and Las Vegas will have to fight it through the 50s, the 60s, well into the 1970s. One of the intriguing ironies of the Kefauver investigation, some of these guys involved in illegal gambling all over the country decided they probably ought to go to where it's legal. So Las Vegas and Reno become a magnet for these fellows who wanted to do what they've been doing illegally. And what it does is bring an extraordinary level of expertise in gaming to Las Vegas.
Las Vegas has long been a city of second chances, especially for men who once ran illegal gambling operations like Benny Binion.
Benny Binion was the head of the gambling rackets in Dallas in the 1930s and early 1940s. He had managed to corrupt the sheriff and the DA in Dallas for like 15 years, but then his guys lost. And the new guys coming in were determined to take down Benny Binion. So Benny literally packed $1 million in the trunk of his Cadillac and drove across the desert to Las Vegas in 1946 and decided he was going to get involved in the gambling industry. He acquired a failing casino called the El Dorado, and then he leased the sort of adjacent Apache Hotel. And he converted these two into what he called the Horseshoe Club. And the Horseshoe Club would be Benny Binion's vision for what a great legal casino would look like.
But Binion had killed 2 men when he lived in Dallas. He claimed self-defense and didn't serve time in jail for the killings. But the Nevada State Tax Commission rejects Binion's initial application for a gambling license.
So Benny starts throwing money around. Basically, that was his solution to many things. And what he did was he was very philanthropic, probably was handing out bribes. And there was a decision made in 1951, late 51, that the Nevada Tax Commission would reconsider Benny's application for a gambling license.
Just 1 year after the Kefauver hearing, the Nevada Tax Commission is singing a very different tune. Checkered past or not, people like Benny Binion are welcome in Las Vegas.
The hearing was conducted in the courtroom in the federal building on Stewart Avenue. It was on a Saturday. First of all, Benny testified. He was quizzed about 2 murders that he had committed in Dallas. One of the individuals, when he was questioned by the tax commissioners, he described as a very bad man. He was a very bad man. And this elicited a number of chuckles from the tax commissioners who seemed to think that, killing somebody was just, part of the job of being a gambling kingpin. And the tax commission, this is 1951, they were like, okay, sounds good to us. And after, several hours of deliberation, the Nevada Tax Commission voted 7-0 to unanimously give Benny a gambling license. Ironically, Dallas officials were at that time putting together a tax evasion case against Benny Binion. Grand jury indicted Binion, and they wanted to extradite him back to Dallas for trial. Well, Benny fought extradition. He comes back to the federal building on Stewart Avenue 10 months after the licensing hearing, and there's a hearing on the extradition. During the hearing, Binion spoke, and he said that he believed that if he were extradited back to Dallas, that he would be murdered. Well, in the end, the judge ruled that he would be extradited back to Dallas, and Benny ultimately pleaded guilty to tax evasion and was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
After serving time, Binion returns to Las Vegas to run the Horseshoe, but is never granted a gambling license again.
One of the trials that is one of my favorite is Senator McCarran, who had recommended my grandfather to the federal bench, didn't like some of the stories that Hank Greenspun with the Las Vegas Sun was producing.
Hank Greenspun arrives in Las Vegas in 1946.
He invests in a radio station, he has a magazine, he's doing publicity for the Flamingo, and then off he goes to help Israel in a war for its survival, just as the country's being founded. And he's gun running. And he's breaking U.S. law. He's doing it, though, and eventually he becomes a national hero in Israel.
In 1950, Greenspun buys a newspaper and renames it the Las Vegas Sun. His crusading style provides an alternative voice to the establishment Las Vegas Review-Journal. One of Greenspun's targets is Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, who Greenspun thinks is a corrupt anti-Semite.
Greenspun attacked Pat McCarran for a variety of reasons, and one of them was McCarran's anti-communist crusade. We call it McCarthyism, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. And Greenspun was critical of it.
McCarran wields enormous power in Las Vegas and decides to silence Greenspun and the Las Vegas Sun. Behind the scenes, he leans on the casino operators.
And so he talked to all of the gaming interests up and down the Strip and downtown and told them not to advertise with the Las Vegas Sun. He wanted to put them out of business.
Most of the major casinos stop advertising in the Las Vegas Sun. In a fight for the Sun's survival, Greenspun strikes back, taking the case to federal court in 1953.
Well, he ultimately files a lawsuit. He seeks close to $250,000, claiming conspiracy and restraint of trade.
The presiding judge is Roger T. Foley. He allows Greenspun's lawyers to call the telephone switchboard operator at the Thunderbird Hotel as a witness. Concerned she will testify about a phone call that will implicate Senator McCarran, the lawyers decide to settle. Greenspun wins $80,000, and all the casinos agree to advertise in the Sun again. Greenspun returns to the federal courtroom in 1955 when he's charged with inciting the assassination of U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy at this time is one of the most feared politicians in America. He's the leader of a crusade to rid the country of communist influences, real or imagined. Greenspun has criticized McCarthy's anti-communist crusade in his newspaper. When McCarthy makes a speech in Las Vegas, he calls Greenspun an admitted ex-communist.
And at the speech that night, Greenspun's there, and McCarthy says he is going to talk now about someone he normally wouldn't talk about, the editor of the local Daily Worker. Well, that's the communist paper. And he starts accusing Greenspun of all kinds of things, calls him an admitted ex-communist. Greenspun said, well, he meant to say admitted ex-convict, which he was.
If McCarthy had been speaking about Greenspun on the floor of the U.S. Senate, he would have enjoyed constitutional immunity for making defamatory comments. But making the comments in Las Vegas exposed him to a potential lawsuit.
And essentially, Greenspun could have sued him for slander by calling him an ex-communist, etc. And suddenly, Greenspun begins publishing a series of articles about McCarthy. And the feeling is he got a hold of some people, or they reached out to him, and he could publish things others couldn't because he knew if McCarthy came after him, he could in turn sue McCarthy. Greenspun later said, "I was just doing to him what he did to everybody else." So after all of these articles attacking McCarthy, on January 8th, 1954, Greenspun does a front page Where I Stand column, ran every day in the paper, still runs today, and it begins, "Senator Joseph McCarthy has to come to a violent end." And he points to Huey Long, who was assassinated in 1935, that how Huey Long died with this hail of bullets is going to be nothing compared with McCarthy. He also says he is opposed to McCarthy getting his head blown off. And he says not because he doesn't deserve it, but because, he says, "I'd hate to see some poor sap get the electric chair for doing a public service."
A grand jury meeting in the federal building returns an indictment of Greenspun for inciting assassination. The prosecutor is U.S. Attorney Madison Graves. Greenspun's local attorneys are the Foley brothers, Tom and Joe, sons of Judge Roger T. Foley. They write a 20-page motion to dismiss the charges.
And they wrote a response and essentially saying, this doesn't stand, you got to throw it out. Well, no, they were going to go to trial. Greenspun ends up getting in touch with an attorney in Washington, D.C. named Ed Morgan. He's one of those guys who seems to pop up in historic places. And he comes out to represent Greenspun.
Morgan shocks the court by calling no witnesses in Greenspun's defense.
So Graves does his closing argument, then Morgan does his. And he talks about the First Amendment and the Constitution and the freedom of the press and the right of the press to be critical. He talks about how, if you think you're going to silence Hank Greenspun, and he points at Barbara Greenspun, she will keep publishing that paper if he's in prison. You're not silencing these people. And in the end, they return a verdict for Greenspun.
While Senator McCarthy's anti-communist campaign sputters, Greenspun's 2 victories in the federal courtroom bolster his reputation as a maverick newspaper publisher.
If the McCarran case proved he wasn't going away, this cemented it.
Throughout the 50s, Nevada officials moved to tighten oversight of the gambling business. As part of the effort, they create the List of Excluded Persons in 1960. The list becomes known as the Black Book.
The Black Book was a list of individuals who were not allowed to enter casinos at all. They had such a notorious reputation that it was a way for the state to kind of avoid any kind of bad publicity with mobsters hanging around casinos. Fast forward to 1963, a mobster named Johnny Marshall. Johnny Marshall, original name Marshall Kefauver, was basically a hitman for the Chicago mob. And he spent a lot of time in Las Vegas. He was named to the state's Black Book. Johnny Marshall decided to challenge this law, this Black Book law, on constitutional grounds. So he went to court over it, and the trial was held in the federal building. Ultimately, Marshall lost the case, and it allowed the state to enforce this law even more vehemently.
Nevada Governor Grant Sawyer later writes that the Black Book served notice that we were trying to do something about getting organized crime out of the gaming industry. Enforcement of the Black Book also puts one of America's most beloved entertainers in a tough spot.
Frank Sinatra had been involved in the casino industry in the early 60s. He had 9% ownership of the Sands Hotel. He had 50% ownership of the Calneva at Lake Tahoe.
The allegation was that he was actually not the owner of those shares at either place, but the front man for Sam Giancana of the Chicago mob. And in 1963, Giancana stayed at the Cal Neva, and Sinatra was called out on it. And Sinatra was saying, well, you can't tell me who my friends are going to be. And they said, well, actually, we can. That's the deal you make when you get a gaming license. And it ended up being a bit of a controversy, with Sinatra cursing out the head of the Gaming Control Board. And Sinatra gave up his license. And that was that, or so it seemed.
Sinatra's alleged connections to organized crime are again highlighted when a grand jury convenes in the Federal Building in 1966 and 67. It hears evidence of casino operators embezzling funds. They take large sums of cash from the counting rooms and deliver it to mobsters around the country. This practice, called skimming, is a major revenue source for organized crime.
So the Federal Building downtown was the scene of an investigation of hearings about skimming. In the early 1960s, the FBI and Bobby Kennedy were both going after organized crime.
Organized gambling is a vicious evil.
And in particular, Las Vegas. And it turned out that they wiretapped Ed Levinson, who ran the Fremont, as well as Ed Torres.
As vice president at the Fremont, Torres works closely with Levinson. Starting on November 25, 1966, a grand jury meets in an office on the 3rd floor of the Federal Building. They subpoena 115 people, most of them casino executives and employees. They also call one high-profile performer and investor, Frank Sinatra.
And it's a fascinating story, because he and his attorney, Milton Rudin, pull up outside the building in a limo and run up the steps. And all the media are outside waiting for him to come to the limo.
So he was interviewed by this grand jury, and they had Sinatra in the building for about 45 minutes. By the time the interview was over, there were an estimated 200 people in front of the building waiting for him to come out. You know, Frank Sinatra was such a huge star, and even though you could see him in a showroom on the Las Vegas Strip, the idea of seeing him come out of this Federal Building in downtown Las Vegas was going to be special for people locally. Well, instead of coming out the front door, he went out the back door through the basement and got into a different vehicle and took off that way.
Nothing ever came of Sinatra, but there were indictments of Levinson and of some of the operators out on the Strip. Levinson and Joe Rosenberg ultimately were convicted, paid small fines.
The FBI believes skimming is much more widespread. They just can't present the evidence. To push back against investigators and illegal wiretaps, members of organized crime syndicates hire smart, hard-nosed lawyers like Oscar Goodman. For Goodman, doing business with the mob begins, simply enough, in the 1960s, when he helps a car dealer at the Hacienda go through bankruptcy.
I didn't know bankruptcy from schmankruptcy, but I had a motto in my law office, where there's a fee, there's a remedy. And I learned how to do it and did bankruptcy with the paperwork and the filing fee, the whole works for $250. He was delighted.
When the dealer is asked to recommend a criminal lawyer in Las Vegas, he suggests Goodman.
I get a phone call that evening from Bob Martin, who was the world's odds maker for sporting events. And he says, "We have something for you. We want to hire you on a case." So he got to his home and he opened the door and he said, "Here's 3 dimes and you better win the case." I didn't know what a dime was. And I opened up the envelope. There were $3,100 bills. I had never seen $3,100 bills in my life at one time. And I said, "I better win the case." It so happened that his brother was a reputed mobster from the East Coast, and my client-to-be was charged with a Dyer Act violation, which is driving a stolen vehicle across state lines. And basically all the government had to do is prove that the defendant was behind the wheel and that the car had been stolen and transported across state lines. Well, I had never tried a federal case before this. I was scared to death because here they hired me to take care of this reputed mobster's brother
The trial is held in the federal courtroom.
And we tried the case, tried it in one day. I still remember the juror who came out first, a nice lady, and I saw a tear. And I said to myself, oh my goodness, I had to have lost this. And she said, we find the defendant not guilty. Well, I can't do better than that. There's nothing like it. You don't win those cases, and I won it. And from that, my career was started. So from that point on, I guess I was a mob lawyer.
With the rapid growth of Las Vegas in the 1940s and 50s, the federal building is bulging at the seams.
Federal agencies start moving out to give the post office more space. At this point, the post office has 62 clerks, up from 11 when they opened in 1933. In 1956, planning for a new federal building begins. And in 1962, President Kennedy signs an appropriation bill that allocates $6 million to construction of a new federal building in Las Vegas. And they break ground on the new federal building in 1965.
In 1967, the government opens a new federal building and courthouse. The building is later named for two federal judges, Roger T. Foley and his son, Roger D. Foley. Most of the federal court cases move into the new building. Parts of the original federal building are repurposed.
They put up their partitions, and they were ugly wooden things or metal, and they didn't really save or preserve that blonde mahogany, and that was sinful. That was just sinful that they would do that.
The state of the federal building reflects what's happening in the rest of downtown from the 1970s into the 1990s. As the city expands, people move to newer developments, and the businesses follow. The Fremont Street Experience opens in 1995, but many of the other downtown businesses are still struggling.
Nothing was happening in the downtown. It had no energy, no spark to it.
In 1999, Oscar Goodman is elected mayor of Las Vegas.
I got elected the mayor, and I looked out of my window the first day, and I said, what happened to the old post office and courthouse? Nobody knew, and I said, let's find out. We called the GSA, General Services Administration, the federal agency that's in charge of federal buildings. And they said, oh, you may have gotten lucky here. I said, why is that? They said, this is surplus, and we will sell it to you. Not to me, but to the city of Las Vegas for $1 if you agree to rehabbing it and using it for cultural or museum purposes. And I thought, that's easy enough.
The city buys the building for $1 in 2002, with the goal of making it a destination for tourists and locals alike.
The idea of preserving this building, of turning it from a federal building into a museum, is a classic example of preserving your history.
But there was one crucial question. What sort of museum could be both a cultural institution and a tourist attraction?
And then the light bulb went on. I said, what makes us different than any place else? We were born from the mob. What is better than having a mob museum?
For Goodman, the federal building is a key component of the revitalization he envisions for downtown Las Vegas.
He really wanted it to be something kind of avant-garde, something that would be a real attractor to tourists downtown and the Strip.
But Goodman's plan to turn the federal building into a museum about organized crime does not sit well with some in the community.
Well, when I started to talk about that, there were a lot of people who looked at me with derision and obloquy and scorn, and they wanted to run me out of town. The Italian American Club wanted to lynch me.
I didn't like the idea of having a mob museum because I thought it would glamorize the mob. And in so many ways, I lived through mob era. I was in Catholic school, and many of our friends, their fathers were involved with the mob. a lot of Italian families. One of my girlfriends called me at about 9 o'clock at night and said, "We're leaving." I said, "Where are you going?" "We're going back to Steubenville until the coast is clear." A couple months later, her father was found dead. It was a scary place when you have these things happening.
I can remember plenty of people saying it's just going to be a monument to Oscar. That was a pretty common sentiment. And let's face it, Oscar Goodman has an ego that he's earned and never really met a camera he didn't like. So it made perfect sense for some people to think that.
Then there was a substantial part of the community that didn't want that part of the community's history brought back to life. By this time, it had faded into the background. And part of the reason they didn't want brought back to life is that they were connected to the mob. Not that they were mob members, but they had worked in the casinos. They had juice. They had connections to and they didn't want to be reminded of that. Their names possibly could be brought up in the mob museum.
There were all kinds of old-time Las Vegans who I respected, former FBI agents, judges, other lawyers. One FBI agent, retired FBI agent, put his finger in my chest and said, "Your father is turning in his grave right now."
But I think several of the other members of the court felt that, strongly that it was an important place and we didn't want to see anything happen to it that wasn't positive in our view.
Well, there were a lot of people that felt that there have been a lot of ventures that have started and failed. And they didn't want the city to hook its wagon to another failed venture, very expensive one.
So at the time that Oscar Goodman started talking about a mob museum, I was at the university, and we knew that it was not going to be just about the mob, that it was going to be about law enforcement. But the Black community is not enamored with either of those, the mob nor the police department. So a lot of people in the Black community did not think that this was a good idea at all.
I mean, it was brutal out there. People in the United States Senate who we were trying to get money for it, they laughed, they made fun of us. But I just knew it was the right thing. It dawned on me that we have to legitimate ourselves. Who could head up this building and this program and take the heat off?
The turning point for the museum was Goodman's decision to invite Ellen Knowlton, a respected member of the local law enforcement community, to chair its board.
When I retired in 2006, I was the special agent in charge of the FBI's Las Vegas division, which covers all of Nevada. At my retirement ceremony, Mayor Oscar presented me with the key to the city. Only he didn't let go. We were having a little tug of war, and he leans in and he said, "I've got something I want you to do." And I said, "Well, who do I have to kneecap for you?" And he said, "No, it's not that." And he tells me about the fact that the city of Las Vegas had been given the former federal courthouse in exchange for $1, and that it would be developed into something for public use. So he had already put together a focus group and they had done some work. And he told me that what the group was leaning towards was to have a museum that detailed the history of Las Vegas as it was shaped by organized crime.
Knowlton agrees to serve as the head of the committee, providing the law enforcement perspective. But that doesn't convince everyone.
I had calls from my counterparts saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, you're going to see."
Yeah, Ellen really kind of lowered the temperature of the criticism. I think when she decided to get on board, it gave it a lot of legitimacy to move forward.
As public confidence in the project grows, the city starts rehabilitating the building and planning for the museum. Covenants dictate that the city has to return the building to its original state and use it for a cultural purpose. The National Park Service will oversee the rehabilitation process.
The building was
in amazing condition, especially the exterior. Yeah, the building had what, I'll use a term that another architect had used, it had good bones. It was very solid.
From purchase to rehabilitation, the work takes 10 years and $42 million.
In the courtroom, we did a fairly strict restoration of the shape and form of the space. The courtroom had been subdivided into two spaces, and we took down the demising wall between the two spaces, and underneath where the wood studs had been added, we saw the red and blue paint. So we knew we had found a great discovery. We reassembled the judge's bench on a new raised platform in the original location. And when we were putting it back together again, we saw that there was a steel plate, we believed to protect the judge from somebody who might arrive with a gun. And we found some images that showed light fixtures in the building that didn't exist for us when the city received the property in 2002. We worked with a company called St. Louis Antique Lighting, who did the reproduction of the lighting for us. And we were able to follow patterns to do stenciling on the new acorn-shaped globes that mimic the historic pattern. Each stencil took about 14 hours to do on each light fixture. And then they were stained with a gold tint, which ends up being just a remarkable luminescent fixture.
We basically went in to rehabilitate the building to meet historic standards, which is basically bringing the building back to its original condition. For instance, they had painted a lot of the nice wood paneling back in the back of the post office especially. So we had to remove all that paint and bring it back to its original wood look.
Parallel with the historic renovations, curators developed the story the Mob Museum will tell. The exhibits will explore the national story of organized crime and law enforcement, with a particular focus on Las Vegas. The first major artifacts acquired for the Mob Museum are connected to one of the most shocking incidents in organized crime history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
So the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred in Chicago in 1929. There were rival bootlegging gangs across Chicago. And one of the biggest in town was the Al Capone's outfit, right? And then you had something called the North Side Gang. And the North Side Gang was probably the biggest rival to Capone. We believe that Capone and his lieutenants hired a group of hitmen from St. Louis to really take out the North Side Gang. They knew that these North Side Gang members were going to hang out in this garage on North Clark Street in Chicago.
4 men, 2 dressed as policemen, enter the Clark Street garage. They order the 7 members of the North Side Gang to line up against a brick wall and shoot them. The wall becomes a symbol of mob violence, a physical piece of history.
The bricks from the wall against which these men were lined up had been recovered from the scene when the building was torn down in 1967. A man named George Patey had acquired these bricks. He put them in a nightclub in Vancouver.
The museum acquires the bricks from Patey's niece in 2009.
If you look at the bricks collectively, they were the first artifact in the Mob Museum's collection and have become really the premier artifact on display at the museum as long as it's been open.
February 14th, 2012, on the anniversary of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the museum opens, and the city throws a Las Vegas-style celebration.
Opening day was great for a lot of different reasons.
Opening day was magical. I mean, this was, I remember it like it was yesterday. Sun was shining. There was a crowd forming right outside the building at the base of the steps. A lot of excitement. We had the Jersey Boys perform on the front steps.
We had a lot of old-time Las Vegas there that night, and to hear their voice, oh, wow, and just the acclamations that this is a nice project. In fact, my mother went up to her old Pox 55, remembered the combination, and opened it right up. It was very authentic. It was a very happy moment. A lot of hard work went in, but it was nice to see it come to fruition that evening.
The day that we opened was like a mix of euphoria and terror. My thrust was get this done and get it open so that we can prove to the community that it has value and it will make downtown a better place.
And it does. People begin flocking to the museum.
I probably was a little surprised at the beginning that people were so attracted by this new museum. And then I went to it. I did the tour. And you can see why. This was just as good as any museum in Washington, D.C.
The Mob Museum is the product of 10 years of work by city officials, the volunteer board of directors, contractors, staff, and many external advisors.
It was great to save that building. I'll just say that, because a lot of other things could have happened when the federal government let go of it, and I'm just proud to be a part of that.
The federal building on Stewart is the most significant piece of architecture in downtown Las Vegas. It represents the history of the community.
The Mob Museum's exhibits chart the rise of organized crime in America and law enforcement's response. The story begins with ethnic immigration in the 19th century, traces the mob's dramatic growth during Prohibition, and tracks its moves into new rackets such as illegal gambling and drug trafficking. The exhibits also explore the expansion of law enforcement to combat organized crime and how new laws and technologies bolstered efforts to bring down the mob. The centerpiece of the museum is the historically restored courtroom, featuring a dynamic 3-screen film experience chronicling the Kefauver Committee hearings. The mob's role in building Las Vegas is highlighted as well. The museum receives widespread recognition as a top museum in the state and the nation. Public programs and events at the museum restore the building's status as a community gathering place.
I told Jimmy that, I said, you know, Jimmy, I saved your life twice.
We weren't able to do it before now. We've been talking about it for 2 years.
Authors, experts, and law enforcement officials share their knowledge and experiences and discuss contemporary criminal justice issues.
We got out of prison. He would not bring me back into this life as much as he needed me.
Thousands turn out each year for the museum's free days. Adhering to strict industry standards, the museum achieves national accreditation after just 5 years of operation.
We knew for people that weren't at the museum, not familiar with us, that there might be, again, some skepticism about how serious-minded an institution this is, so which is why we pursued that accreditation, so we'd have that kind of stamp of approval that really a very small percentage of museums ever achieve.
In 2017, the museum embarks on a major renovation that introduces several new exhibits and experiences.
We also understood that growth also means refreshing the exhibits and adding new ways in which we can grow our audience, be more interactive. And I think that also comes from kind of philosophically the team surrounding the museum. We've always been about growth. And being better and not resting on our laurels. So we did an improvement project where we refreshed the exhibits on the first floor. So 6 years after we opened the museum for the first time, we reopened with new experiences on the first floor, bringing in contemporary organized crime topics, a crime lab, where people could go in and experience forensic science topics, a use of force experience area, and really bring in some very authentic, dynamic experiences where people could understand what law enforcement does. We also moved our offices out of the basement, much more appropriately for us to continue the story about Prohibition and turn the basement into the underground. So create a speakeasy experience space that's actually a working speakeasy, telling the stories of where people were consuming booze during Prohibition and being able to experience it so fully. And then adjacent to that is our distillery, where we actually make moonshine.
While the improvements expand the ways in which guests can experience the museum, the Federal Building remains the star of the show.
As someone who believes in historic preservation and adaptive reuse and finding things to do with old buildings to make them work, the Mob Museum is a wonderful example of the whole thing working.
Preservation was the important thing, I think, for all of us. And it's turned out, of course, to be far better than I think any of us could have envisioned.
Even though there was some opposition initially to the Mob Museum, most of that opposition, if not all of it, has disappeared. The people of this community, they recognize and almost embrace this part of our history, not because they're glorifying mobsters, but because it definitely is different. Las Vegas always prides itself on being different. It's all about inventing something from whole cloth in the middle of the desert and having some help from some underworld characters to do it.
Underworld characters had nothing to do with the rise of the Federal Building in the desert sands of Las Vegas. Forward-looking citizens, combined with an expanding federal presence in American life, produced a building that has served the community for almost a century. Now, in its second life as a museum, this downtown landmark will be preserved for generations to come.